Section 12 of The Supernatural in Modern English Fiction by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 7. Supernatural Science. The application of modern science to supernaturalism, or of the supernatural to modern science, is one of the distinctive features of recent literature. Ghostly fiction took a new and definite turn with the rapid advance in scientific knowledge and investigation in the latter part of the 19th century, for the work of Darwin, Spencer, Huxley, and their co-laborers did as much to quicken thought and romance as in other lines. Previous literature had made but scant effort to reflect even the crude science of the times, and what was written was so unconvincing that it made comparatively little impress. Almost the only science that Gothic fiction dealt with, to any noticeable extent, was associated with alchemy and astrology. The alchemist sought the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, while the astrologer tried to divine human destiny by the stars. Zofloya dabbled in diabolic chemistry, and Frankenstein created a man-monster that was noteworthy as an incursion into supernatural biology. Yet they are almost isolated instances. Now each advance in science has had its reflection in supernatural fiction, and each phase of research contributes plot material, while some of the elements once considered wholly of the devil are now scientific. The sorcerer has given place to the bacteriologist and the botanist. The marvels of discovery have displaced miracles as basis for unearthly plot material, and it is from the laboratory that the ghostly stories are now evolved, rather than from the vault in the charnel room as in the past. Science not only furnishes extraordinary situations for curdling tales, but it is an excellent hook to hang supernatural tales upon, for it gives an excuse for believing anything, however incredible. Man is willing to accept the impossible, if he be but given a modern excuse for it. He will swallow the wildest improbability if the bait be labeled science or psychical research. No supernaturalism is incredible if it is expressed in technical terminology, and no miracle will be rejected if its setting be in a laboratory. One peculiar thing about modern scientific thought and its reaction upon fiction is that it is equally effective in realism, such as shown in the naturalistic novels of Zola, the plays of Brieux, and others, and in supernaturalism as in the work of H.G. Wells, for instance, where the ghostly is grafted on to cold realism. The transition from the sorcerer, the wizard, the warlock of older fiction to the scientist in the present has been gradual. The sorcerer relied wholly upon supernatural, chiefly diabolic agencies for his power, while the wizard of the modern laboratory applies his knowledge of molecules and gases to aid his supermortal forces. Modern science itself seems miraculous, so its employment in ghostly stories is but natural. The Arabian Nights' tales seem not more marvelous than the stories of modern investigations. Hawthorne's narratives stand between the old and the new types of science. His Rappaccini, Dr. Heidegger, Gafford Oliver, Septimius Felton and his rivals in search for the elixir of youth, as well as the husband who sought to efface the birthmark from his young wife's cheek, being related in theme to the older conventional type, and in treatment to the new. Poe's scientific stories are more modern in method and material, and in fact he made claim of originality of invention for the idea of making fiction plausible by the use of scientific laws. His Descent into the Maelstrom, Message Found in a Bottle, and other stories were novel in the manner in which they united the scientifically real and the supernatural. The Pit and the Pendulum, with its diabolical machinery, is akin to the modern mechanistic stories, rather than to anything that had preceded it. Poe paved the way for H.G. Wells' use of the ghostly mechanical and scientific narratives, as his stories of hypnotism, with its hideous aftermath of horror, must have given suggestion for Arthur Machen's revolting stories of physical operations with unearthly consequences. An example of the later manifestations of supernaturalism in connection with science is in Sax Rohmer's tales of Fu Manchu, the Chinese terror, the embodied spirit of an ancient evil that entered into him at his birth, because of his nearness to an old burying ground, and who, to his unholy alliance, unites a wizard knowledge of modern science in its various aspects. With every power of cunning and intellect intensified, with a technical knowledge of all means with which to fight his enemies, he ravages society as no mere sorcerer of early fiction could do. The modern stories of magic have a skillful power of suggestiveness, being so cunningly contrived that on the surface they seem plausible and natural, with nothing supernatural about them. Yet behind this seeming simplicity lurks a mystery, an unanswered question, an unsolved problem. W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw, for instance, is one of the most effectively terrible stories of magic one could conceive of. The shriveled paw of a dead monkey that is believed by some to give its possessor the right to have 3 wishes granted becomes the symbol of inescapable destiny. The weird, or fate, of the old tragedy, though the horrors that follow upon the wish's rash utterance may be explained on natural grounds. The insidious enigma is what makes the story unforgettable. Barry Payne's Exchange might be given as another example of problematic magic that owes its power to elusive mystery. The witch woman, the solitary fate who appears to persons offering them such dreadful alternatives, might be conceived of as the figment of sick brains, yet the reader knows that she is not. Richard Middleton's The Coffin Merchant seems simple enough on the surface, and the literal-minded could explain the occurrence on normal grounds, yet the story has a peculiar haunting supernaturalism. A coffin merchant claims to be able to know who among passers-by will die soon, and hands a man an advertisement for a coffin, asserting that he will need it. The man later goes to the shop to rebuke the merchant for his methods, but ends by signing a contract for his own funeral. On leaving, he shakes hands with the dealer, after which he unconsciously puts his hand to his lips, feeling a slight sting. He dies that night. Of what? Of poison? Of fear? Of supernatural suggestion? Or in the natural course of events? The series called The Strange Cases of Dr. Stanchion, by Josephine Descombe Bacon, shows instances occurring among the clientele of a famous brain specialist, where the materialist might put aside the explanation of the supernatural, only to be confronted by still greater problems. The relation between insanity and ghostliness in recent fiction is significant, and forms the crux of many a story since Poe. Mrs. Bacon's The Miracle, for instance, has its setting in an insane asylum, but the uncanny happenings almost convince us of the sanity of the patients and the paranoia of the outsiders. We come to agree with the specialist that every person is more or less a paranoiac, and none more so than he who scoffs at the supernatural. Another aspect of the transfer of magic in modern fiction to a scientific basis is that of second sight or supernatural vision. This motif still retains all its former effect of the unearthly, perhaps gaining more since the scientific twist seems to give the idea that the ghostly power resides in the atoms and molecules and gases and machines themselves, rather than in the person who manipulates them, which is more subtly haunting in its impression. Second sight has been used as a means for producing uncanny effects all along the line of fiction. Defoe even used it in a number of his hoax pamphlets, as well as in his History of Duncan Campbell, and folklore is full of such stories, especially in the Highlands. The modern use of supernatural vision is based apparently on natural science, which makes the weird power more striking. The Black Patch by Randolph Hartley tells of an experiment in optics that produces a strange result. 2 students exchange left eyeballs for the purpose of studying the effects of the operation, leaving the right eye in each case unimpaired. When the young men recover from the operation, and the bandages are removed, they discover that an extraordinary thing has taken place. The first, while seeing with his right eye his own surroundings as usual, sees also with his left, which is his friend's left, that is, what the friend is looking at with his right eye, thousands of miles away. The severing of the optic nerve has not disturbed the sympathetic vision between the companion eyes, so this curious double sight results. In a quarrel arising from this peculiar situation, the first man kills the second, and sees on his left eye the hideous image of his own face distorted with murderous rage, as his friend saw it, which is never to be effaced, because the companion eye is dead and will see no more. Another instant of far-sightedness is told in John Kendrick Bangs' The Speck on the Lens, where a man has such an extraordinary left eye that when he looks through a lens he sees round the world, and gets a glimpse of the back of his own head, which he thinks is a speck on the lens. Only 2 men in the world are supposed to have that power. The Remarkable Case of Davidson's Eyes by H.G. Wells is an interesting example of this new scientific transference of magic vision. Davidson is working in a laboratory which is struck by lightning, and after the shock he finds himself unable to visualize his surroundings, but instead sees the other side of the world, ships, a sea, sands. The explanation given by a professor turns on learned theories of space and the 4th dimension, He thinks that Davidson, in stooping between the poles of the electromagnet, experienced a queer twist in his mental retinal images, through the sudden force of the lightning. As the author says, it sets one dreaming of the oddest possibilities of intercommunication in the future, of spending an intercalary 5 minutes on the other side of the world, of being watched in our most secret operations by unexpected eyes. Davidson's vision comes back queerly, for he begins to see the things around him by piecemeal, as apparently the two fields of vision overlap for a time. Brander Matthews, in the kinetoscope of time, introduces an instrument with eyepieces that show magic vision. The beholder sees scenes from the past, from literature as well as from life, has glimpses of Salome dancing, of Esmeralda, witnesses the combat between Achilles and Hector, the tourney between Saladin and the Knight of the Leopard. The magician offers to show him his future, for a price, but he is wise enough to refuse. Magic views of the future constitute an interesting aspect of the supernatural vision in modern stories. The Lifted Veil by George Eliot is an account of a man who has prophetic glimpses of his fate, which seem powerless to warn him since he marries the woman who he knows will be his doom, and he is aware that he will die alone, deserted even by his servants, yet cannot help it. He sees himself dying when the attendants, off on their own concerns, knows every detail beforehand, but unavailingly. This suggests Amos Judd by J.A. Mitchell, which is a curious instance of the transition stage of second sight, related both to the old sorcerer type and to the new scientific ideas. Amos Judd, so called, is the son of an Indian Raja, sent out of his country because of a revolution, and brought up in ignorance of his birth in a New England farmhouse. Vishnu, in the far past, has laid his finger on the brow of one of the Raja's ancestors, thereby endowing him with the gift of magic vision, which descends once in 100 years to someone of his line. Amos Judd, therefore, can see the future by pictures, beholding clearly everything that will happen to him. He sees himself lying dead at a desk, on which stands a calendar marking the date, November 4th. His friends persuade him to live past the date, and they think all is well, till one day, while he is on a visit to a strange house, he is killed by an assassin. They find him lying at a desk with an out-of-date calendar beside him, marking November 4th. Barry Payne endows a bulldog with the power to foretell the future, to reveal disaster and oppose it. Zero, in the story by that name, is a common bulldog greatly valued because he has a supernatural knowledge of any evil that threatens those he loves, and by his canine sagacity he forestalls fate. In the end, in protecting his master's little child, he is bitten by a mad dog, whose coming he has supernaturally foreseen, and he commits suicide as the only way out of the difficulty. Arthur Machen, in The Bowmen and Others, tells various stories of supernatural vision associated with the war. The Door in the Wall by H.G. Wells depicts a man who, in his dreamy childhood, wanders into a secret garden where he is shown the book of his past and future, but who afterwards is unable to find the door by which he enters, though he seeks it often. Later in life, at several times, when he is in a special haste to reach some place for an important appointment, he sees the door, but does not enter. Finally, he goes in to his death. This is an instance of the suggestive supernaturalism associated with dreams and visions. The use of mirrors in supernatural vision is significant and appears in a number of ways in modern fiction. Scott's My Aunt Margaret's Mirror is an early instance, where the magician shows the seeker a glass wherein she sees what is taking place in another country, sees her husband on his way to the altar with another woman, sees a stranger stop the marriage, and witnesses the fatal duel. Hawthorne has used mirrors extensively as symbolic of an inner vision, of a look into the realities of the soul. For instance, when poor Feathertop, the make-believe man, the animated scarecrow, looks into the mirror, he sees not the brave figure the world beholds in him, but the thing of sticks and straw, the sham that he is, as the minister shrinks from the mirrored reflection of the black veil, symbol of mystery that he wears. Hawthorne elsewhere speaks of echo as the voice of the reflection in a mirror, and says that our reflections are ghosts of ourselves. Mr. Titbottom in George William Curtis's Prue and I, who has the power of seeing into the souls of human beings by means of his magic spectacles and catching symbolic glimpses of what they are instead of what they appear to be, beholds himself in a mirror and shrinks back aghast from the revelation of his own nature. Barry Payne's story, referred to in another connection, shows a mirror wherein a supernatural visitant reveals to a young man the supreme moments of life, his own and those of others, pictures of the highest moments of ecstasy or despair, a fulfillment of dear dreams. The Silver Mirror, by A. Conan Doyle, represents a man alone night after night, working with overstrained nerves on a set of books, who sees in an antique mirror a strange scene reenacted and finds later that the glass has once belonged to Mary, Queen of Scots, and that he has seen the murder of Rizzio. Brander Matthews also has a story concerned with recreated images in an old mirror. The looking glass in fiction seems to be not only a sort of hand conscience, as Markheim calls it, but a betrayer of secrets, a revealer of the forgotten past, a prophet of the future as well. It is also a strange symbol to show hearts as they are in reality, reflecting the soul rather than the body. It is employed in diverse ways and is an effective means of supernatural suggestion, of ghostly power. The fourth dimension is another motif that seems to interest the writers of recent ghostly tales. They make use of it in various ways and seem to have different ideas concerning it, but they like to play with the thought and twist it to their whim. Ambrose Bierce has a collection of stories dealing with mysterious disappearances, in which he tells of persons who are transferred from the known, calculable space to some non-Euclidean space, where they are lost. In some strange pockets of nowhere they fall, unable to see or to be seen, to hear or to be heard, neither living nor dying, since in that space is no power of life or of death. It is all very mysterious and uncanny. He uses the theme as the basis for a number of short stories of ghostly power, which offer no solution but leave the mystery in the air. In some of these stories, Bierce represents the person as crying out and being heard, but no help can go, because he is invisible and intangible, not knowing where he is nor what has happened to him. H.G. Wells, in the Plattner case, which shows an obvious influence of Bierce, gives a similar case. He explains the extraordinary happenings by advancing the theory that Plattner has changed sides. According to mathematics, he says, we are told that the only way in which the right and left sides of a solid body can be changed is by taking that body clean out of space as we know it, out of ordinary existence, that is, and turning it somewhere outside space. Plattner has been moved out into the fourth dimension and been returned to the world with a curious inversion of body. He is absent from the world for 9 days and has extraordinary experiences in the other world. This happens through an explosion in the laboratory where he is working, similarly to Wells' story of Davidson, where the infringement on the fourth dimension is the result of a lightning stroke. Mary Wilkins Freeman deals with the fourth dimension in the hall bedroom, where the boarder drifts off into unknown space, never to return from gazing at a picture on the wall, as has happened in the case of previous occupants of the room. Richard Middleton employs the same idea in a story of a conjurer who nightly plays a trick in public, causing his wife to seem to disappear into space. One night she actually does so vanish, never to be seen again. Other instances of the form may be found in recent fiction. H.G. Wells uses the theme with a different twist in his Time Machine. Here the scientist insists that time is the fourth dimension, that persons who talk of the matter ordinarily have no idea what it is, but that he has solved it. He constructs a machine which enables him to project himself into the future or into the past, and sees what will happen or what has happened in other centuries. He lives years in the space of a few moments, and has amazing adventures on his temporal expeditions. But finally, the fourth dimension, which may be thought of as a terrible fate or inescapable destiny awaiting all who dally with it, gets him too, for he fails to return from one of his trips. Another story tells of a man who, by drinking quantities of green tea, could project himself into the fourth dimension. A number of stories of scientific supernaturalism are concerned with glimpses into the future. The Time Machine just mentioned, with its invasions of the unknown space and time, its trips into eternity by the agency of a miraculous vehicle, illustrates the method. The scientist finds that he can travel backwards or forwards, accelerating or retarding his speed as he will, and get a section of life in any age he wishes. He discovers that in the future, which he visits, many reforms have been inaugurated, preventative medicine established, noxious weeds eradicated, and yet strange conditions exist. Mankind has undergone a twofold involution, the soft conditions of life having caused the higher classes to degenerate into flabby beings of no strength, while an underground race has grown up of horrible, depraved nature, blind from living in subterranean passages, cannibalistic, while the others are vegetarian. The lower classes are like hideous apes, while the higher are effeminate, relaxed. The traveler escapes a dire fate only by rushing to his machine and returning to his own time. Samuel Butler suggests that machines will be the real rulers in the coming ages, that man will be preserved only to feed and care for the machines, which will have attained supernatural sensibility and power. He says that mechanisms will acquire feelings and tastes and culture, and that man will be the servant of steel and steam in the future, instead of master as now. That engines will wed and rear families, which men as slaves must wait upon. Frank R. Stockton gives another supernatural scientific glimpse into the future, showing as impossibilities certain things that have since come to pass, while some of the changes prophesied as imminent are yet unrealized and apparently far from actualities. Jack London's Scarlet Plague pictures the earth returned to barbarism, since most of the inhabitants have been swept away by a scourge and the others have failed to carry on the torch of civilization. H.G. Wells gives account of a tour into futurity, wherein the miracles of modern science work revolutions in human life, and he satirizes society, showing a topsy-turvy state of affairs in A.D. 2100. His dream of Armageddon is a story of futurity, wherein a man has continuous visions of what his experiences will be in another life far in the future. That life becomes more real to him than his actual existence. And he grows indifferent to events taking place around him, while rent with emotion over the griefs to come in another age. Of course, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, with its social and mechanistic miracles that now seem flat and tame to us, might be said to be the father of most of these modern prophecies of scientific futurity. Samuel Butler's Erewhon contains many elements of impossibility in relation to life, and is a satire on society, though perhaps not strictly speaking supernatural. These prophecies of the time to come are in the main intended as social satires, as symbolic analyses of the weaknesses of present life. They evince vivid imagination and much ingenuity in contriving the mechanisms that are to transform life, yet they are not examples of great fiction. Mark Twain reverses the type in his Connecticut Yankee at King Arthur's Court, for he shows a man of the present taking part in the life of the far past, managing to parody both medievalism and the Yankee character at once. H.G. Wells is particularly interested in studying the unused forces of the world and fancying what would happen under other conditions. His play of scientific speculation has produced many stories that he does not greatly value now himself, but which are of interest as showing certain tendencies of fiction. Views of other planets form a feature of modern supernaturalism, for the writer now sets his stories not only on Earth, in heaven, and in hell, but on other worlds besides. The astrologer of ancient fiction, with his eye fixed ever on the stars, seeking to discern their influence on human destiny, appears no more among us. He has been replaced by the astronomer who scans the stars, yet with a different purpose in fiction. He wishes to find out the life of citizens of other planets, rather than to figure out the fate of mortals on the Earth. Many stories of modern times cause new planets to swim into our literary ken and describe their citizens with ease. H.G. Wells stars here as elsewhere. In his War of the Worlds, he depicts a struggle between the Earth people and the Martians, in which many supernatural elements enter. The people of Mars are a repulsive horde of creatures, yet they have wonderful organization and command of resources, and they conquer the Earth to prey upon it. This book has suffered the inevitable parody. In The Crystal Egg, Wells describes a curious globe in which the gazer can see scenes reflected from Mars. The author suggests two theories as to the possibility of this. Either that the crystal is in both worlds at once, remaining stationary in one and moving in the other, and that it reflects scenes in Mars so that they are visible on Earth, or else by a peculiar sympathy with a companion globe on the other planet, it shows on its surface what happens in the other world. It is hinted that the Martians have sent the crystal to Earth in order that they might catch glimpses of our life. In The Star, Wells gives yet another story of the future, of other planetary influences. By the passing of a strange star, life on Earth is convulsed and conditions radically changed. These conditions are observed by the astronomers on Mars, who are beings different from men, yet very intelligent. They draw conclusions as to the amount of damage done to the Earth, satirizing human theories as to Mars. The day of the comet shows earthly life changed by the passing of a comet, but instead of the destruction described in the other story, the social conditions are vastly improved, and a millennium is ushered in. Wells makes a voyage to the moon possible by the discovery of a substance which resists gravity. Other instances might be given, for there has been no lack of lunar literature, but they are not usually worth much. Du Maurier's The Martian, which combines the elements of metempsychosis, automatic writing, and dream supernaturalism with the idea of ghostly astronomy, tells of a supernatural visitant from Mars. The Martian is a young woman whose spirit comes to inhabit a young man to whom she dictates wonderful books in his dreams. She writes letters to him in a sort of private code, in which she tells of her previous incarnations on Mars, of the Martians who are extraordinary amphibious beings, descended from a small sea animal. They have unusual acuteness of senses, with an added sixth sense, a sort of orientation, a feeling of a magnetic current, which she imparts to her protégé, Barty Jocelyn. Jack London tells the story of interplanetary metempsychosis, wherein the central character, a prisoner in San Quentin, finds himself able to will his body to die at times, thus releasing his spirit to fly through space and relive its experiences in previous incarnations. Barry Payne's The Celestial Grocery is a fantasy of insanity in the supernatural, with its setting on 2 planets. It contains a cab horse that talks and laughs, and other inversions of the natural. A man is taken on a journey to another world, sees the stars and the earth and space beneath him, and finds everything different from what he has known before. People there have 2 bodies and send them alternately to the wash, though they seldom wear them. The celestial shop sells nothing concrete, only abstractions, emotions, experiences. One may buy measures of love, requited or unselfishly hopeless, of political success, of literary fame, or of power, or whatnot. Happiness is a blend, however, for which one must mix the ingredients for himself. The story is symbolic of the ideals of Earth, with a sad, effective satire. The end is insanity, leaving one wondering how much of it is pure fantasy of a madman's brain, or how much is actuality. It is reminiscent of Hawthorne's Intelligence Office, with its symbolic supernaturalism. Hypnotism enters largely into the fiction of modern times. Hypnotism may or may not be considered as supernatural, yet it borders so closely onto the realm of the uncanny, and is so related to science of today as well as to the sorcery of the past, that it should be considered in this connection, for it carries on the traditions of the supernatural. In its earlier stages, hypnotism was considered as distinctly diabolic, used only for unlawful purposes, being associated with witchcraft. It is only in more recent times that it has been rehabilitated in the public mind, and thought of as a science which may be used for helpful ends. It is so mysterious in its power that it affords complications in plenty for the novelist, and has been utilized in various ways. In some cases, as F. Marion Crawford's The Witch of Prague, it is associated still with evil power, and hell is a black art. Unorna has an unearthly power gained through hypnotism, which is more than hypnotic, and which she uses to further her own ends. Strange scientific ideas of life and of death are seen here, and someone says of her, "You would make a living mummy of a man. I should expect to find him with his head cut off, and living by means of a glass heart, and thinking through a rabbit's brain." She embalms an old man in a continuous hypnotic lethargy, recalling him only at intervals to do mechanically the things necessary to prolong life. She is trying to see if she can cause human tissue to live forever in this embalmed state, hoping to learn through it the secret of eternal life. This, of course, suggests Poe's stories of the subject, mesmeric revelations, and the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar. The latter is one of the most revolting instances of scientific supernaturalism, for the dying man is mesmerized in the moment of death and remains in that condition, dead yet undecaying and speaking, repeating with his horrible tongue the statement, "I am dead." After 7 months, further experiments break the spell, and he, pleading to be allowed to be at peace in death, falls suddenly away into a loathsome liquid putrescence before the eyes of the experimenters. The Portent, by George MacDonald, is a curious study of hypnotic influence, of a woman who is her true self only when in a somnambulistic state. A supernatural connection of soul exists between her and a youth born on the same day, and it is only through his hypnotic aid that she gains her personality and sanity. James L. Ford plays with the subject by having a group of persons in an evening party submit themselves to be hypnotized in turn, each telling a true story of his life while in that condition. W.D. Howells combines mesmerism with spiritualism in his novel, where the seances are really the result of hypnotism, rather than supernatural revelation as the medium thinks. H.G. Wells has used this theme, as almost every other form of scientific ghostliness, though without marked success. The prize story of hypnotism, however, still remains du Maurier's Trilby, for no mesmerist in this fiction has been able to outdo Svengali. Uncanny chemistry forms the ingredient for many a modern story. The alchemist was the favored feature of the older supernatural fiction of science, and his efforts to discover the philosopher's stone and to brew the magic elixir have furnished plots for divers stories. He does not often waste his time in these vain endeavors in recent stories, though his efforts have not altogether ceased, as we have seen in a previous chapter. A. Conan Doyle is among the last to treat the theme, and makes the scientist find his efforts worse than useless, for the research student finds that his discovery of the art of making gold is disturbing the nice balance of nature and bringing injury to those he meant to help, so he destroys his secret formula and dies. The elixir of youth illustrates the transference of power from the sorcerer to the scientist, for the magician that gives the stranger a potion to restore his youth tells him that he is not a sorcerer, not a diabolic agent, but a scientist learning to utilize the forces that are at the command of any intelligence. Barry Payne's The Love Filter is related both to the old and the new types of supernatural chemistry. A man loves a woman who doesn't care, so he asks aid of a wise woman, who gives him a potion that will surely win the stubborn heart. As he lies asleep in the desert on his way back, he dreams that his love says to him that love gained by such means is not love, so he pours the liquid on the sand. When he returns, the woman tells him that she has been with him in his dreams, and loves him because he would not claim her wrongly. Blue Roses is another of his stories of magic that brings love to the indifferent. Twilight by Frank Danby is a novel based on the relation between morphia and the supernatural. A woman ill of nervous trouble, under the influence of opiates, continually sees the spirit of a woman dead for years, who relives her story before her eyes, so that the personalities are curiously merged. This inevitably suggests Dr. Quincy's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, with its dream wonders, yet it has a power of its own, and the skillful blending of reality with dream supernaturalism and insanity has an uncanny distinction. Fu Manchu, the Chinese wonder worker in Sax Rohmer's series of stories bearing that name, is a representative example of the modern use of chemistry for supernormal effect. He employs all the forces of up-to-the-minute science to compass his diabolic ends, and works miracles of chemistry by seemingly natural methods. By a hypodermic injection, he can instantly drive a man to acute insanity, incurable save by a counter-injection, which only Fu Manchu can give, but which as instantly restores the reason. By another needle, he can cause a person to die, to all intents and purposes at least, and after the body has been buried for days, he can restore it to life by another prick of the needle. He terrorizes England by his infernal powers, killing off or converting to slavery the leading intelligence that oppose him. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is perhaps the best known instance of chemical supernaturalism. Here the magic drug not only changes the body, evolving from the respectable Dr. Jekyll his baser self in the form of Mr. Hyde, enabling him to give rein to his criminal instincts without bringing reproach on his reputation, but has the subtle power to fix the personality of evil, so that each time the drug is used, Hyde is given a stronger force and Jekyll is weakened. This fictive sermon on dual nature, the ascendance of evil over the nobler soul if it be indulged, seems yet an appallingly real story of human life. In a similar fashion, Arthur Machen uses supernatural chemistry most hideously in The Three Impostors, where a certain powder perverts the soul, making man a sharer in the unspeakable orgies of ancient evil forces. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells shows an unusual application of chemistry to ghostly fiction that gives a peculiar effect of reality, because its style is that of scientific realism. By experimentation with drugs, a man finds a combination that will render living tissue absolutely invisible. When he swallows a portion of it, he cannot be seen. His clothes appear to be walking around by themselves, and the complications are uncanny. As one may see, the comic possibilities are prominent, and for a time we laugh over the mystification of the persons with whom he comes in contact. But soon stark tragedy results. During the man-chase, as the hunted creature seeks to escape, the people hear the thud-thud of running steps, watch bloody footprints form before their eyes, yet see nothing else. Here is a genuine thrill that is new in fiction. The man gradually becomes visible, but only in death is his dreadful figure seen completely again. This modern method of transferring to science the idea of invisibility so prominent in connection with ghosts, showing the invisibility as the result of a chemical compound, not of supernatural intervention, affecting a living man, not a spirit, makes the effect of supernaturalism more vivid even than in the case of ghosts. These are only suggestions of the varied uses to which chemistry has been put in producing ghostly plots, and utilizing in novel ways the conventional motifs of older stories. These themes are more popular now than they would have been half a century ago, because now the average reader knows more about scientific facts, and is better prepared to appreciate them. A man ignorant of chemistry would care nothing for the throes of Dr. Jekyll or the complicating experiences of the Invisible Man, because he would have slight basis for his imagination to build upon. Each widening of the popular intelligence and each branch of science added to the mental store of the ordinary reader is a distinct gain to fiction. Supernatural biology looms large in modern fiction, though it is not always easy to differentiate between the predominance of chemical and biological motifs. In many cases the two are tangled up together, and as in the stories of dual personality and invisibility just mentioned, one may not readily say which is uppermost, the biological or the chemical side, for the experiments are of the effects of certain drugs upon living human tissue. There are various similar instances in the fiction of scientific supernaturalism. Hawthorne's The Birthmark is a case of chemical biology, where the husband seeking to remove by powerful drugs the mark from his wife's cheek succeeds in doing so, but causes her death. Here the supernaturalism is symbolic, suggested rather than boldly stated, as is usually the case with Hawthorne's work. A. Conan Doyle in The Los Amigos Fiasco shows supernaturalism based on the effect of electricity on the body, for the lynchers, in trying to kill a man by connecting him with a dynamo, succeed in so magnetizing him that he can't be killed in any way. Sax Rohmer tells one Fu Manchu's story of a mysterious murder committed by means of an imprisoned gas that escapes from a mummy case and poisons those exposed to it. And in another he introduces a diabolic red insect attracted by the scent of a poisonous orchid that bites the marked victim. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau is a ghastly study in vivisection. Two scientists on a remote island with no other human inhabitants try unspeakable experiments on animals, trying by pruning and grafting and training the living tissue to make them human. They do succeed in a measure, for they teach the beast to talk and to observe a sort of jungle law laid down by man. Yet the effect is sickening. The animals are not human and never can be, and these revolting experiments deprive them of all animal dignity without adding any of the human. In the end, they revert to savagery, becoming even more bestial than before. The most dreadful biological experiments in recent fiction are described in Arthur Machen's volume of short stories, The House of Souls. In one story, an operation on the brain enables a victim to see the great god Pan, to have revelations of ancient supernaturalism, wherein Pan and the devil are united in one character. In another, a delicate cutting of the brain removes the soul, which takes the form of a wonderful jewel, and utterly diabolizes the character. These curious and revolting stories are advanced instances of scientific diabolism, and leave a smear on the mind. They are more horrible than the creation of Frankenstein's man-monster, for here, moral monsters are evolved. Medicated supernaturalism associated with prenatal influence occurs in various stories where a supernormal twist is given, because of some event out of the ordinary. Ambrose Bierce's The Eyes of the Panther, a story of a young woman who is a panther for part of the time as a result of a shock, is associated with the snake nature of Elsie Venner. Barry Payne's The Undying Thing is one of the most horrible of such complications, for because of a mother's fright over a pack of wolves, a monster is born, neither wolf nor human, neither animal nor man, neither mortal nor immortal. It is hidden in a secret cave to die, yet lives on, though not living, to fulfill a curse upon the ancient house. A. Conan Doyle's The Terror of Blue John Gap is a story of a monstrous animal, like a bear yet bigger than an elephant, that ravages the countryside. The theory for its being is that it is a survival in a subterranean cave of a long-extinct type from prehistoric times that comes out in its blindness to destroy. There are other examples of supernormal animals in modern fiction, yet these suffice to illustrate the genre. Botany furnishes its ghostly plots in fiction as well as other branches of science, for we have plant vampires and witches and devils. Trees and flowers are highly psychic and run a gamut of emotions. Hawthorne shows us supernatural plants in several of his novels and stories, such as the mysterious plant growing from a secret grave, which has a strange poisonous power, or the flowers from Gaffer Dolliver's garden that shine like jewels and lend a glow to the living face near them when worn on a woman's breast. In Rappaccini's Daughter, the garden is full of flowers of subtle poison, so insidious that their venom has entered into the life of the young girl, rendering her a living menace in those around her. She is the victim of her father's demonic experiments and the effects of poison on the human body, and her kiss means death. Algernon Blackwood tells of the uncanny power of motion and emotion possessed by the trees, where the forest exercises a magnetic force upon human beings sympathetic to them, going out after men and luring them to their fate. He describes the cedar as friendly to man, and attempting but in vain to protect him from the creeping malignant power of the forest. Fu Manchu, Sax Rohmer's Chinese horror, performs various experiments in botany to further his dreadful ends. He develops a species of poisonous fungi, till they become giant in size, and acquire certain powers through being kept in the darkness. When a light is turned on them, the fungi explode, turning loose on the men he would murder, fumes that drive them mad. From the ceiling above are released ripe spores of the giant Impusa, for the air in the second cellar, being surcharged with oxygen, makes them germinate instantly. They fall like powdered snow upon the victims, and the horrible fungi grow magically, spreading over the writhing bodies of the madmen and wrapping them in ghostly shrouds. In The Flower of Silence, he describes a strange orchid that has the uncanny habit of stinging or biting when it is broken or roughly handled, sending forth a poison that first makes a man deaf, then kills him. Fu Manchu introduces this flower into the sleeping rooms of those he wishes to put out of the way, and sends them into eternal silence. The Flowering of the Strange Orchid by H.G. Wells is the story of a murderous plant, a vampire that kills men in the jungle, and in a greenhouse in England sends out its tentacles that grip the botanist, drinking his blood and seeking to slay him. This orchid has the power to project its vampiric attacks when it is a shriveled bulb or in the flower. This reminds us of Algernon Blackwood's story of the vampire soil, which after its psychic orgy burst into loathsome luxuriant bloom where before it had been barren. It is a curious heightening of supernatural effect to give to beautiful flowers diabolical cunning and murderous motives, to endow them with human psychology and devilish designs. The magic associated with botany is usually black instead of white. One wonders if transmigration of soul does not enter subconsciously into these plots, and if a vampire orchid is not a trailing off of a human soul, the murderous blossom a revenge ghost expressing himself in that way. The plot in this type of fiction are wrought with much imagination, and the scientific exactness combined with the supernatural gives a peculiar effect of reality. There are varied forms of supernatural science that do not come under any of the heads discussed. The applications of research to weird fiction are as diverse as the phases of investigation, and only a few may be mentioned to suggest the variety of themes employed. Inversion of natural laws furnishes plots, as in Frank R. Stockton's tale of negative gravity, with its discovery of a substance that enables a man to save himself all fatigue by means of a something that inverts the law of gravity. With a little package in his pocket, a man can climb mountains without effort, but the discoverer miscalculates the amount of energy required to move and finally rises instead of staying on the earth till his wife has to fish him into the second-story window. Poe's loss of breath illustrates another infringement of a natural law, as do several stories where a human being loses his shadow. In The Diamond Lens, Fitzjames O'Brien tells of a man who, looking at a drop of water through a giant microscope, sees in the drop a lovely woman with whom he falls madly in love, only to watch her fade away under the lens as his despairing eyes see the water evaporate. Supernatural acoustics enters in the story of a man who discovers the sound center in an opera house and reads the unspoken thoughts of those around him. He applies the laws of acoustics to mentality and spirituality, making astounding discoveries. Bram Stoker combines superstition with modern science in his books, as where Oriental magic is used to fight the encroachments of an evil force emanating from a mummy, as also to bring the mummy to life, while a respirator is employed to keep away the subtle odor. He brings in blood transfusion, together with superstitious symbols, to combat the ravages of vampires. Blood transfusion also enters into supernaturalism in Stephen French Whitney's story, where a woman who has been buried in a glacier for 2,000 years is recalled to life. The Human Chord by Algernon Blackwood is a novel based on the psychic values of sounds, which claims that sounds are all-powerful, are everything, for forms, shapes, bodies, are but vibratory activities of sound made visible. The research worker here believes that he who has the power to call a thing by its proper name is master of that thing or of that person, and that to be able to call the name of deity would be to enable one to become as God. He seeks to bring together a human chord, 4 persons in harmony as to voice and soul, who can pronounce the awful name and become divine with him. He can change the form or the nature of anything by calling its name, as a woman is deformed by mispronunciation, and the walls of a room expanded by his voice. He can make himself a dwarf or a giant at will, by different methods of speaking his own name. He says that sound could recreate or destroy the universe. He has captured sounds that strain at their leashes in his secret rooms, gigantic, wonderful. But in the effort to call upon the mighty name, he mispronounces it, bringing a terrible convulsion of nature which destroys him. The beholders see an awful fire in which letters escape back to heaven in chariots of flame. Psychology furnishes some interesting contributions to recent fiction along the line of what might be called momentary or instantaneous plots. Ambrose Bierce's The Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is a good example, where a man is being hanged, and in the instant between the drop from the bridge and the breaking of the neck, he lives through long and dramatic adventures, escaping his pursuers by falling into the river and swimming ashore, reaching home at last to greet his wife and children, yet in a second his lifeless body swings from the bridge. The Warning by Josephine Dascom Bacon shows the case of a man who lives years in another country during a few moments of acute mental strain carried to the point of paranoia. Barry Payne has a story where, in the time in which a man drives home from the theater, he visits another planet and changes the current of his life, while Algernon Blackwood compresses a great experience into a few minutes of dreaming. One noteworthy point in connection with the scientific supernaturalism is that these themes appear only in novels and short stories. They do not cross over into poetry as do most of the other forms of the ghostly art. Perhaps this is because the situations are intellectual rather than emotional. Brain problems or studies and mechanisms rather than in feelings or emotions. The province of science is removed from that of poetry because the methods and purposes are altogether different. The scientific methods are clear-cut, coldly intellectual. Science demands an exactness, a meticulous accuracy hostile to poetry which requires suggestion, vagueness, veiled mystery for its greatest effect. The Flower of Silence, for instance, would be a fitting title for a poem, but the poetic side would be destroyed by the need for stating the genus and species of the orchid and analyzing its destruction of human tissue. Nature's mysterious forces and elements in general and vaguely considered, veiled in mists of imagination and with a sense of vastness and beauty, are extremely poetic, but the notebook and laboratory methods of pure science are antagonistic to poetry, though they fit admirably into the requirements of fiction, whose purpose is to give an impression of actuality. Another reason why these scientific themes do not pass over into poetry may be that scientific methods as we know them are new, and poetry clings to the old and established conventions and emotions. There is amazing human interest in these experiments, a veritable wealth of romance, with dramatic possibilities, tragic and comic, yet they are more suited to prose fiction than to poetry. We have adapted our brain cells to their concepts in prose, yet we have not thus molded our poetic ideas. It gives us a shock to have new concepts introduced into poetry. An instance of this clash of realism with sentiment is shown in a recent poem where the setting is a physics laboratory. Yet in a few more decades we may find the poets eagerly converting the raw materials of science into the essence of poetry itself, and by a mystic alchemy more wonderful than any yet known, transmuting intellectual problems of science into magic verse. Creation, by Alfred Noyes, is an impressive discussion of evolution as related to God. Perhaps another reason why these themes have not been utilized in poetry is because they are too fantastic, too bizarre. They lack the proportion and sense of artistic harmony that poetry requires. Strangeness and wonder are true elements of poetry, and magic is an element of the greatest art, but in solution, as it were, not in the form observed in science. The miracles of the laboratory are too abrupt, too inconceivable, save by intellectual analysis, and present too great a strain upon the powers of the imagination. They are fantastic, while true poetry is concerned with the fancy. Magic and wonder in verse must come from concepts that steal upon the imagination and make appeal through the emotions. Thus some forms of supernaturalism are admirably adapted to the province of poetry, such as the presence of spirits, visitations of angels or demons, ancient witchcraft, and so forth. The elements that have universal appeal through the sense of the supernatural move us in poetry, but the isolated instances, the peculiar problems that occur in scientific research if transferred to poetry, would leave us cold, yet they may come to be used in the next vers libre. Nor do these situations come over in the drama, save in rare instances. Theodore Dreiser, in a recent volume, Plays of the Natural and the Supernatural, makes use of certain motifs that are striking and modern, as where a physician goes on the operating table, the dramatis personae, including demiaphon, nitrous acid, and alcepharon, a power of physics, as well as several shadows, mysterious personages of vagueness. These shadows here, as in the blue sphere, are not altogether clear as to motivation, yet they seem to stand for fate interference in human destiny. In the latter play, fate is also represented by a fast male, which is one of the active characters, menacing and destroying a child. One reason why these motifs of science are not used in drama to any extent is that they are impossible of representation on the stage. Even the wizardry of modern producers would be unable to show a power of physics or nitrous acid, save as they might be embodied as were the symbolic characters in Maeterlinck's Bluebird, which would mean that they would lose their effect. And what would a stage manager do with the rhythm of the universe which enters into Dreiser's play? Many sounds can be managed off stage, but hardly that, one fancies. These themes are not even found in closet drama, where many other elements of supernaturalism, which would be difficult or impossible of presentation on the stage, trail off. William Sharp's Vistas, for instance, could not be shown on the stage, yet the little plays in that volume are of wonderful dramatic power. The drama can stand a good deal of supernaturalism of various kinds, from the visible ghosts and devils of the Elizabethans to the atmospheric supernaturalism of Maeterlinck, but it could scarcely support the presentations of chemicals and gases and supernatural botany and biology that fiction handles with ease. The miraculous machinery would balk at stage action. Fancy the Time Machine stage, for instance. We notice in these scientific stories a widening of the sphere of supernatural fiction. It is extended to include more of the normal interests and activities of man than has formerly been the case. Here we notice a spirit similar to that of the leveling influence seen in the case of the ghosts, devils, witches, angels, and so forth, who have been made more human, not only in appearance but in emotions and activities as well. Likewise, these scientific elements have been elevated to the human. Supernatural as well as human attributes have been extended to material things, as animals are given supernormal powers in a sense different from and yet similar to those possessed by the enchanted animals in folklore. Science has its physical as well as psychic horrors, which the scientific ghostly tales bring in. Not only are animals gifted with supernatural powers, but plants as well are humanized, diabolized. We have strange murderous trees, vampire orchids, flowers that slay men in secret ways with all the smiling loveliness of a treacherous woman. The demonics of modern botany form an interesting phase of ghostly fiction and give a new thrill to supernaturalism. Inanimate, concrete things are endowed with unearthly cunning and strength, as well as animals and plants. The new type of fiction gives to chemicals and gases a hellish intelligence, a diabolic force of minds. It creates machinery and gives it an excess of force. A supernatural, more than human cunning. Sometimes helpful, sometimes demonic. Machines have been spiritualized and some engines are philanthropic, while some are like damned souls. This scientific supernaturalism concerns itself with mortal life, not with immortality, as do some of the other aspects of the genre. It is concrete in its effects, not spiritual. Its incursions into futurity are earthly, not of heaven or hell, and its problems are of time, not of eternity. The form shows how clear cold intelligence plays with miracles and applies the supernatural to daily life. The enthusiasm, wild and exaggerated in some ways, that sprang up over the prospects of what modern science and investigation would almost immediately do for the world in the latter half of the 19th century, had no more interesting effect than in the stimulating of scientific fictive supernaturalism. And though mankind has learned that science will not immediately bring the millennium, science still exercises a strong power over fiction. This type shows a strange effect of realism and supernaturalism because of the scientific methods, For supernaturalism imposed on material things produces an effect of verisimilitude not gained in the realm of pure spirit. Too intellectually cold for the purposes of poetry, too abstract and elusive for presentation in drama, and too removed by its association with the fantastic aspects of investigation and the curiosities of science to be very appropriate for tragedy, which has hitherto been the chief medium of expressing the dramatic supernatural. Science finds its fitting expression in prose fiction. It is an illustration of the widening range of the supernatural in fiction, and as such is significant. End of Chapter 7. Section 13 of The Supernatural in Modern English Fiction by Dorothy Scarborough. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 8. Conclusion. In the previous chapters, I have endeavored to show the continuance and persistence of the supernatural in English fiction, as well as in other forms of literature, and to give some idea of the variety of its manifestations. There has been no period in our history, from Beowulf to present, when the ghostly was not found in our literature. Of course, there have been periods when the interest in it waned, yet it has never been wholly absent. There is at the present a definite revival of interest in the supernatural appearing in the drama, in poetry, and in fiction, evident to anyone who has carefully studied the recent publications in magazines. Within the last few years, especially in the last 2 years, an astonishing amount of ghostly material has appeared. Some of these stories are of the hoax variety, others are suggestive, allegorical, or symbolic, while others frankly accept the forces beyond man's mortal life and human dominion. I hesitate to suggest a reason for this sudden rising tide of occultism at this particular time, but it seems clear to me that the war has had much to do with it. I have found a number of supernatural productions directly associated with the struggle. Among them might be mentioned Catherine Fullerton Gerald's extraordinary elusive story of horror, The Second Coming by Frederick Arnold Kummer, and Henry P. Jane's, where Christ walks the battlefields on Christmas Eve, pleading with the Kaiser to stop the slaughter of men, but in vain, and the carnage goes on till Easter, when the Christ stands beside the dying emperor with the roar of the rioting people heard in the streets outside, and softens his heart at last, so that he says, "Lord, I have sinned, give my people peace." Kipling's ghost story, with its specters of children slain by the Germans. The Grey Guest, showing Napoleon returning to lead the French forces to victory in a crisis. Jeanne the Maid, where the spirit of Joan of Arc descends upon a young French girl of today, enabling her to do wonderful things for her countrymen. War Letters from a Living Dead Man, a series of professed psychic communications from the other world, by Elsa Barker. Real Ghost Stories, a volume containing a number of stories by different writers, describing some of the phantoms seen by soldiers on the battlefield. And Arthur Machen's The Bowmen, a collection of striking fictive instances of crowd supernaturalism associated with the war. The last volume affords an interesting glimpse into the way in which legends are built up, for it is a contemporary legend in connection with the angels at Mons. Karl Hauptmann has a striking play showing the use of war supernaturalism in the drama. When the eyes of the world are turned towards the battlefields, and death is an ever-present reality, it is natural that human thoughts occupy themselves with visions of a life after death. Kingdom Come, by Vida Sutton, shows the spirits of Russian peasants slain for refusing to fight, specters unaware that they are dead. Various martial heroes of the past are resurrected to give inspiration in battle in recent stories. But whatever be the reason for this revival of the ghostly, the fact remains that this is distinctly the day for the phantom and his confreres. While romanticism is always with us, it appears in different manifestations. A few years ago, the swashbuckling hero and his adventures seemed the most striking survival of the early days of romanticism. But now, the weird and the ghostly have regained a popularity which they never surpassed even in the heyday of Gothic fiction. The slashing sword has been displaced by the psychographic pen. The crucial struggles now are occult rather than adventurous as before, and while realism in fiction is immensely popular, never more so than now, it is likely to have supernaturalism overlaid upon it, as in De Morgan's work, to give a single example. Recent poetry manifests the same tendency, and likewise the drama, particularly the closet drama and the playlet, while literary history shows clearly the continuity of the supernatural, with certain rise and fall of interest in it at different periods. It is apparent that now there is a more general fondness for the form than at any other time in English literature. The supernatural is in solution and exists everywhere. Recent poetry shows a strong predilection for the uncanny, sometimes in the manner of the old ballads, while in other instances the ghostly is treated with a spirit of critical detachment, as in Rupert Brooke's sonnet, or with skepticism, as in his sardonic satire on faith. In the recent volume of Brooks's collected poems, there are about a dozen dealing with the supernatural. Maeterlinck expressed the feeling that a spiritual epoch is perhaps upon us. As Poe said, that we are in the midst of great psychical powers. As Francis Thompson says in his Hound of Heaven, Nature, poor stepdame, cannot slake our drought. The interest in certain lines of thought which lead to the writing of supernatural fiction, as spiritualism or folklore, or science or psychical research, may have the reflex action of arousing interest in the subjects themselves, but at all events there is no lack of uncanny literature at present. One feature of the modern supernatural literature, as distinguished from that of other periods, is in the matter of length. Of course the ballad and the folk tale expressed the ghostly in brief form, but the epic held the stage longer, while in Elizabethan times the drama was the preferred form, as in the 18th century the Gothic novel. During the 19th century, particularly the latter half, the preference was decidedly for the short story, while more recently the one-act play has come into vogue. But in the last few years, the supernatural novel seems to be returning to favor, though without displacing the shorter forms. Brevity has much to commend it as a vehicle for the uncanny. The effect of the ghostly may be attained with much more unity in a short story or playlet than in a novel or long drama, for in the more lengthy form much outside manner is necessarily included. The whole plot could scarcely be made up of the unearthly, for that would mean a weakening of power through exaggeration, though this is sometimes found to be the case, as in several of Bram Stoker's novels. Recently, the number of novels dealing with supernatural themes has noticeably increased, which leads one to believe that the occult is transcending even the limitations of length and claiming all forms for its own. Now, no literary type bars the supernatural which appears in the novel as in the story, in the drama as in the playlet, and in narrative, dramatic, and lyric poetry. Even the epic of the more than mortal has not entirely vanished, as the work of Dr. William Cleaver Wilkinson attests. But popular taste does not really run to epics nowadays. The ghostly is more often seen in the shorter forms, where brevity gives a chance for compression and intensity of force difficult in longer vehicles. The rise of the one-act play in popular favor is significant in this connection. The short dramas of Synge, Yeats, Lady Gregory, William Sharp, Gordon Bottomley, and Theodore Dreiser show the possibilities of the playlet for weird effect. Maeterlinck's plays for marionettes are especially powerful, but the work of Lord Dunsany furnishes more peculiar ghostliness than that of any other present dramatist. His jade idols, for instance, that wake to terrible life and revenge themselves on presumptuous mortals, are a new touch in dramatics. Algernon Blackwood is doing more significant work in psychic fiction than anyone else, his prose showing poetic beauty as well as eerie power. Another modern material is the mechanistic. This is the age of machinery, and even engines are run by ghost power. Examples of the mechanical spook are legion. There is the haunted automobile in Harriet Prescott Spofford's story The Mad Lady, that reproduces through its speaking tube the long-dead voice that runs away with its occupants, reliving previous tragic experiences. A phantom Ford is an idea combining romanticism with realism, surely. In connection with this extraordinary car is a house that erects itself out of dreams and is substantial enough for living purposes. Other specimens are John Kendrick Bang's enchanted typewriter that clicks off psychograms in the dark between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. Frank R. Stockton's machine for negativing gravity, Poe's balloon in which Hans Pfaall makes his magic trip to the moon, Wells' new accelerator that condenses and intensifies vital energy, enabling a man to crowd the forces of a week into an hour of emergency, as likewise his time machine that permits the inventor to project himself into the future or the past at will, to spend a weekend in any era. The butterfly in Hawthorne's story shows the spiritualization of machinery as the poor artist of the beautiful conceived it. The delicate toy imbibing a magnetism, a spiritual essence that gives it life and beauty and power of voluntary motion. This etherealized machinery is manifest in modern fiction as well as the diabolic constructions that wreck and ruin. Inanimate objects have a strange power in later fiction, as Poe's ship that is said in certain seas to increase in size, as the trees told of by Algernon Blackwood that grow in the picture. There are various haunted portraits, as the picture of Dorian Gray that bears on its face the lines of sin the living face does not show, and whose hands are blood-stained when Dorian commits murder. And the painting told of in De Morgan's A Likely Story that overhears a quarrel between an artist and his wife, the woman wrongly suspecting her husband and leaving him. The picture relates the story to a man who has the painting photographed and a copy sent to the wife. There is the haunted tapestry that is curiously related to the living and to the long dead. Another aspect of the later, as distinguished from the earlier occult literature, is the attention paid to ghostly children. Youngsters are coming to the front of the stage everywhere nowadays, particularly in America, so it is but natural that they should demand to be heard as well as seen in supernatural fiction. In the Gothic ghosts, I found no individualized children, and children in groups only twice. In one of James Hogg's short novels, a vicious man is haunted on his deathbed by the specters of little ones dead because of him, but they are nameless and indistinguishable. In Maturin's The Albigenses, a relentless persecutor, while passing through a lonely forest, sees the phantoms of those he has done to death, little children and babes at the breast, as well as men and women. But here again they are not given separate character, but are merely group figures, hence do not count. There is a ghost child mentioned in Hawthorne's Blithedale Romance, but it is not until more recent fiction that children's ghosts enter personated and individualized. The exquisitely shy little ones in Kipling's They are among the most wonderful of his child creations, very human and lovable. In A War Story, he shows us the phantoms of several children whom the Germans have killed, natural youngsters with appealing childish attributes, especially the small boy with his pride in his first trousers. Arthur Machen tells of a German soldier who has crucified a child against the church door and is driven to insanity by the baby spirit. Quiller Couch shows the specter of a little girl that returns at night to do homework for the living, visible only as two slender hands, who remind us of the shepherd boy Richard Middleton tells of, who, having died because of his drunken father's neglect, comes back to help him tend the sheep. Algernon Blackwood relates the story of a little child who has been wont to pray for the unquiet ghost of Petovel, a wicked man who haunts his house. After the child is dead, the mother sees the little boy leaving Petovel by the hand and says, "He's leading him into peace and safety. Perhaps that's why God took him." Richard Middleton's story of a little ghost boy is poignantly pathetic. The little chap comes back to play with his grieving sister, making his presence known by his gay feet dancing through the bracken and his joyous imitations of an automobile's chug-chug. Mary Macmillan speaks of the spirits of little children that are out earlier at night than the older ghosts, because they have to go to bed earlier, being so young. Two very recent child ghosts are wee brown Elsbeth, whom Frances Hodgson Burnett shows to us, the wraith of a little girl pitifully slain centuries ago by her father to save her from torture, who comes back to play with a living playmate, and the terrible revenge ghost of the child slain by her stepfather, who comes back to cause his death, whom Ellen Glasgow describes. The spirits of children that never were enter into the late stories, as in The Children by Josephine Dascom Bacon, a story of confused paranoia and supernaturalism. A woman grieves over the children she never had till they assume personality and being for her. They become so real that they are finally seen by other children who wish to play with them. This reminds us of Thomas Bailey Aldrich's imagined child, Miss Mehitabel's son. Algernon Blackwood shows us a multitude of baby spirits with reaching arms, pattering steps, and lisping voices, spirits of the unborn that haunt childless women. The room which they enter seems sacred with the potentialities of motherhood, so that a man sleeping there sees his own dead mother return to him among the babes. These ghosts of little children that never were and never may be are like the spirits of the yet-to-be-born children in Maeterlinck's dream drama, where in the land of the future the child souls wait for the angel to summon them to life. In these stories associating children with the ghostly, there is always a tender pathos, a sad beauty that is appealing. The spectral insect or animal is another innovation in recent fiction, though there have been occasional cases before, as Virgil's Culex, the story of the ghost of a gnat killed thoughtlessly coming back to tell its murderer of its sufferings in the insect Hades. Robert W. Chambers shows us several ghostly insects, a death's head moth that is a presager of disaster, and a butterfly that brings a murderer to justice, while Frederick Swanson in a story makes a spectral insect a minister of fate. The most curdling example, however, of the entomological supernaturalism is Richard Marsh's novel, The Beetle, a modernized version of the ancient superstitions of Egypt, whereby a priestess of Isis continues her mysterious, horrid life, alternately as a human being and as a beetle. This lively scarab has mesmeric magic power over mortals, and by its sensational shape-shifting, furnishes complicating terror to the plot. The dog is frequently the subject of occult fiction, more so than any other animal, perhaps because the dog seems more nearly human than any save possibly the horse. Mrs. Elizabeth Stuart Phelps Ward shows us a dog very much at home in heaven, while she has a ghost dog on earth, coming back to march in a Decoration Day parade beside his master. Isabel Howell Fisk, in a drama, shows the Archangel Raphael accompanied by his dog, a cavortive canine, not, apparently, archangelic. Ambrose Bierce evokes one terrible revenge ghost, a dog that kills the murderer of his master, while Eden Philpotts represents a pack of spectral dogs that pursue the evil one over the earth till the judgment day, each being a lost soul. A young girl's little unbaptized baby is thought to be one of the number. Conan Doyle's Hounds of the Baskervilles is a terrifying canine of legendary power. Kerfuffle by Edith Wharton shows the ghosts of 5 dogs, each carefully individualized. A Chinese sleeve dog, a rough, brindled bulldog, a long-haired white mongrel, a large white pointer with one brown ear, and a small black greyhound. These specters of animals that have been killed by a jealous husband — he had a cheerful habit of strangling every pet his wife cared for and laying it without a word on her pillow — appear once a year on the anniversary of the day on which the wife in desperation slew him. They preserve a most undog-like silence and follow the beholder with strange gaze. Kipling's dog Harvey is a supernatural beast, but what he represents I have never been able to determine. At the Gate is a recent story showing a great concourse of dogs just outside the portals of heaven, unwilling to enter till their masters come to join them. The Diabolic Horse, in Poe's Metzengerstein, is a curious composite of metempsychosis, haunted inanimate object, and straight ghost, but at all events sufficiently terrifying to the victim it pursued. Algernon Blackwood and Wendigo has created a supernatural animal that flies through the air and carries men away to insanity and death. Henry Rideout shows the ghost of a white tiger, while there are assorted elephant spooks, and Miss Burns in her studies and Shropshire folk tales relates stories of human beings whose ghosts appear as animals suited to the personality of the deceased, as bears, bulls, hogs, and so forth. That adds a new terror to death. Not only are new materials introduced in the later fiction of the uncanny, but new types are stressed. In addition to the weird stories told with direct aim in art, ghosts for ghost's sake, there are tales where the supernatural element is of secondary importance, being used to teach some truth or ridicule some fallacy. The symbolic, humorous, and satiric methods abound in modern occult fiction, and when well done, have a double effect: that of primary supernatural impressiveness, and in addition, of the subtler purposes behind the stories. Moralized legends, spiritual allegories, such as Hawthorne wrote with consummate art, have continued to the present and form a contrast to the crude machinery of Gothic horrors. The delicacy of suggestion, the power of hinted ghostliness, though manifest in Shakespeare, are really modern achievements, for no one save him attained to them in earlier art. Mystic poetic fiction, spiritual symbolism, appears in much of the modern unearthly writing. In certain cases, it is interesting to note the change of old mythological stories into moral allegory. The plays and the stories of Lord Dunsany are peculiarly symbolic, and have the force of antique mythology made instant and real, yet they have a distinctive touch all their own. For instance, the story of the king who goes over the world seeking his lost yesterday, his dear past, who is told by the weird keeper of the bygone years that he cannot have it back. No, not one golden second, has a delicate pathos of poetry. When the mournful king has gone back to his palace, a hoar harper comes who plays for him, and lo, to the strings of the harp have clung the golden seconds of his happiest hours, so that he lives them over again while the music lasts. The Book of the Serpent tells symbolic stories that are poems in prose, fantastic fables. The creator is making experiments with dust heaps, while the serpent, the turtle, and the grasshopper look on, ask questions, and offer comments. The serpent trails all through the dust heap, meant as stuff for artists, and the maker drops a tear in that whereof he means to make mothers. He experiments with monkeys trying to learn how to best make man. And after man is complete, he makes woman. The stories of Oscar Wilde have, some of them, a beauty like that of some antique illuminated missal, with its jeweled words, its mystic figures. Wilde's ornate style, prose that trembles on the verge of poetry, full of passion and color and light, makes one think of his own words in The Nightingale and the Rose, where the poet's song was builded of music by moonlight and stained with his own heart's blood. The delicate suggestion of the unearthly, the element of suspense that gives the sense of the supernatural to that which may be mortal, is seen in such stories as A Dream of Provence by Frank Wedmore. The ancient belief that the soul may return to the body within a few days after death forms the basis for this dream poem in prose. It shows the soul on tiptoe for the unseen, with a love transcending the barriers of the grave, revealing idyllic sorrow in a father's love that denies death, and expresses the sense of expectancy and the hope of a miracle, with a beauty that is almost unbearable. Something of the same theme, of a father's waiting by his daughter's grave to hear the loved voice once more, is expressed in Andreyev's story. But here there is horror and remorse instead of holy love. When the father cries out, the silence that issues from the grave is more terrible than ghostly sounds would be, more dreadful in its supermortal suggestion. The purely humorous supernaturalism is essentially a new thing. The old religious dramas had used comic devils, and Peele's Ghost of Jack is supposed to be humorous, but not at all in the modern sense. There was nothing in early drama or fiction like the rollicking fun of Richard Middleton's Ghost Ship or Frank R. Stockton's spectral humorists. The work of John Kendrick Bangs illustrates the free and easy manner of the moderns towards ghosts, picturing them in unconventional situations and divesting them of all their ancient dignity. He shows us the wraith of the maiden who drowned herself in a fit of pique, for what she is punished by having to haunt the ancestral house as a shower bath. His spectral cook of Bangletop is an original revenge ghost, with a villainous inversion of H's, who haunts an estate because a medieval baron discharged her without wages. His convivial spooks in their ghost club, his astrals who play pranks on mortals, and their confreres, are examples of the modern flippancy toward supernaturals. The satirical use of supernaturalism is also new. Late literature laughs at everything with a daring familiarity undreamed of before, save in sporadic cases. The devil has been an ancient subject for laughter, but recent fiction ridicules him still more, so that we have scant respect for him, while the ghost, formerly a personage held in great respect, now comes in for his share of ragging. No being is too sacred to escape the light arrows of fun. Heaven is satirically exploited, and angels, saints, and even deity have become subjects for jesting, conventionalized with the mother-in-law, the tenderfoot, the Irishman, and so forth. There is a considerable body of anecdotal literature of the supernatural, showing to what extent the levity of treatment has gone. Various aspects of mortal life are satirized, as in Inez Haynes Gilmore's Angel Island, which is a campaign document for women's suffrage. Satiric supernaturalism is employed to drive home many truths, to puncture conceits of all kinds, and when well done is effective, for laughter is a clever weapon. The advance of the later supernatural fiction over the earlier is nowhere seen more distinctly than in increased effectiveness with which it manages the mechanics of emotion, its skill in selecting and elaborating the details by which terror and awe are produced. The present-day artist of the uncanny knows how to strike the varied tones of supernaturalism, the shrill notes of fear, the deep diapason of awe, the crashing chords of horror. The skillful writer chooses with utmost care the seemingly trivial details that go to make up the atmosphere of the unearthly. Shakespeare was a master of that, but none other of his time. The knocking at the gate in Macbeth, for instance, is a perfect example of the employment of a natural incident to produce an effect of the supernatural, as De Quincey has pointed out in his essay on the subject. The Gothic novel relied largely for its impressiveness on emphasizing ghostly scenes by representing aspects of weather to harmonize with the emotions of the characters. This was overworked in terror fiction, and while it still possesses power, it is a much less common method of technique than it used to be. Poe's introductory paragraph in The Fall of the House of Usher is a notable example of skill in creating atmosphere of the supernatural by various details, including phenomena of weather. And Hardy shows special power in harmonizing nature to the moods and purposes of his characters. Yet many a modern story produces a profound sense of awe, and purges the soul by means of terror, with no reference at all to foreboding weather. However, the illusions now made are more skillful and show more selective power than of old. Gothic fiction had much to say of melancholy birds that circled portentously over ancient castles filled with gloom and ghosts, but they were generic and not individual specimens. The fowl was always spoken of as a bird of prey, a night bird, a bat, an owl, or by some such vague term. Natural history has become more generally known since those times, and writers of today introduce their ominous birds with more definiteness and appropriateness. The repulsive bat that clings to the window ledge in Bram Stoker's novel is a vampire, a symbol of the whole horrible situation, as the kite that soars menacingly overhead in another of his novels is individualized and becomes a definite thing of terror. Poe's raven is vastly more a bird of evil than any specimen in the Gothic aviary. Robert W. Chambers brings in a cormorant several times as a portent of ghostly disaster, particularly foreboding when it turns toward the land. On the dark glistening cliffs, silhouetted against the glare of the sea, sat a cormorant, black, motionless, its horrible head raised toward heaven. There is in recent fiction no bird more dreadful in import than the belled buzzard, that Irvin Cobb makes the leading figure in his story by that name. This is an excellent example of the use of the natural to produce terror and awe, for the murderer sees in the bird a minister of fate, and the faint tinkle of its bell as it soars over the marsh where the body lies buried paralyzes him with horror. At last he can bear no more, and hearing it, as he thinks close at hand, he shrieks out his confession, only to find this time that it is not the belled buzzard at all that he hears, but only an old cowbell that a little Negro child has picked up in the barnyard. Robert W. Chambers in his early stories contrives to give varying supernatural effects by descriptions of shadows as symbolic of life and character. He speaks of shadows, of spirits, or of persons fated to disaster as white. Against his supernatural shadows may be gray. Gray is a favored shade for ghostly effect, whether for witches or for phantoms, and sometimes they are perfectly black, to indicate differing conditions of destiny. Quiller Couch has a strange little allegory. The magic shadow, and other writers have used similar methods to produce uncanny effects. The Gothic romance made much use of portents of the supernatural, which later fiction does as well, but differently and with greater skill. The modern stories, for the most part, abandon the conventional portents, the dear old clock forever striking 12 or 1. There was no Gothic castle so impoverished as to lack such ghostly horologe. The abbey bell that tolls at touch of spirit hands or wizard winds, the statuesque nosebleed, the fire that burns blue at approach of a spectre, and so forth. The later story is more selective in its aids to ghostly effect, and adapts the means desired to each particular case, so that it hits the mark. For instance, the sardonic laughter that sounds as the burglars are cracking the gate of heaven to get in, and imagining what they will find, is prophetic of the emptiness, the nothingness, that meets their astounded gaze when they are within. Ambrose Bierce in some of his stories describes the repulsiveness of the fleshly corpse, reanimated by the spirit, perhaps not the spirit belonging to it, with a loathly effect more awful than any purely psychic phantom could produce, which reminds us somewhat of the corpse come to life in Thomas Lavelle Beddoes' Death's Jest Book. The horrors of invisibility in modern fiction avail to give a ghastly chill to the soul that visible apparitions rarely impart. Likewise, the effect of mystery, of the incalculable element, and giving an impression of supernaturalism is a recognized method of technique in many stories, as the minister's black veil in Hawthorne's symbolic story. The unspeakable, revolting suggestion in Edith Wharton's The Eyes, where a man is haunted by two hideous eyes that have the physical effect of a bad smell, whose look left a smear like a snail, is built up with uncommon art. We do not realize how much is due to insanity and how much to the supernatural, when after telling the story of his obsession, his fears that at climax he will become like those eyes, the man suddenly sees his reflection in the mirror and meets their dreadful gaze. He and the image confronted each other with a glare of slowly gathering hate. Mention might be made of an incident in a recently published literary drama, where a man seeks over the world for the unknown woman with whom he has fallen in love, and on his calling aloud in question as to who she is, the grave, with nettle-bearded lips, replied, "It is I, Death." These are only suggestions of numberless instances that might be given of modern technique of supernaturalism that surpasses anything in Gothic fiction. The effectiveness of modern ghostly stories is aided by the suggestiveness of the unearthly given by the use of sensitives, animals or persons that are peculiarly alert to the occult impressions. We see in many stories that children perceive the supernatural presences more quickly than adults, as in Mrs. Oliphant's story of the ghost returning to right a wrong, trying strenuously to make herself known to the grown person and realized only by a little child. In Belasco's play, the little boy is the first and for a long time the only one to sense the return of Peter Grimm. In Maeterlinck's The Blind, the baby in arms is aware of the unearthly presences better than the men and women. Sometimes the sensitive is a blind person. As the old grandfather in another of Maeterlinck's short plays, who is conscious of the approaching death before any of the others, or blind Anna in D'Annunzio's drama The Dead City. Animals are quick to perceive supernatural manifestations. Cats in fiction are shown as being at ease in the presence of ghosts, perhaps because of their uncanny alliance with witches, while dogs and horses go wild with fear. This is noticed in many stories, as in Bulwer Lytton's story of the haunted house, where the dog dies of terror in the face of the ghostly phenomena. The psychic doctor told of in Blackwood's Uncanny Stories, who goes to a house possessed by evil spirits, takes with him a cat and a dog, which by their difference of action reveal to him the presence of the spirits long before they are visualized for him. In general, there is more power of suggestion in the later ghostly stories than in the earlier. The art is more subtle, the technique more skillfully studied, more artfully accidental. There is in modern fiction, notably the work of Poe and that of many recent writers, Russian, French, and German as well as English, a type of supernaturalism that is closely associated with insanity. One may not tell just where the line is drawn, just how much of the element of the uncanny is the result of the broodings of an unbalanced brain and how much is real ghostliness. Poe's studies of madness verge on the unearthly, as do Maupassant's, Hoffman's, and others. Josephine Dascombe Bacon illustrates this genre in a recent volume of stories, The Strange Cases of Dr. Stanchion, the plots centering round instances of paranoia occurring in the practice of a famous alienist. Yet they are not paranoia alone. One instance is of a girl who is haunted by the ghost of a nurse, who has died because given the wrong medicine by mistake. She is on the borderline of insanity when her lover cries aloud that he would take the curse on himself for her if he could, which, by some unknown psychic law, does effect a transference which frees her and obsesses him. Another is that of a man in the insane asylum who recognizes in a mysterious housekeeper the spirit of his wife, who comes from the grave to keep him company and vanishes on the day of his death. These are curious analyses of the idea fixe and its effect on the human mind, of insanity as a cause or effect of the supernatural. Barry Payne's Celestial Grocery is a recent example, a story of a man whose madness carries him to another planet, showing him inverted aspects of life, where emotions are the only real things, all else but shadows. Du Maurier's pathetic novel portraying the passion and anguish and joy of Peter Ibbotson that touches the thin line between sanity and madness, showing in his dream metempsychosis a power to relive the past and even to live someone else's life, is a striking example. One interesting aspect of that story is the point where the spirit of Mary changes from dream lover of 28 to the ghost of the woman of 52, since she has died and can no more come to her lover as she once did, but must come as her own phantom. There are extraordinary effects of insanity associated with the supernatural in the work of Ambrose Bierce, of Arthur Machen, and others of the modern school. Italian literature shows some significant instances in Fogazzaro's The Woman and D'Annunzio's Sogno d'un mattino di primavera. As Lord Dunsany says of it, who can say of insanity, whether it be divine or of the pit? We have noticed in preceding chapter 2 aspects of modern supernaturalism as distinguished from the Gothic, the giving of cumulative and more terrible power to ghostly beings, and on the other hand, the leveling influence that makes them more human. The excess of horror and unearthly force as shown in the characters described by certain writers is significant. In the work of Bierce, Machen, Blackwood, Stoker, and others, supernaturalism is raised to the nth power, and every possible thrill is employed. The carrying ghosts of Bierce, animated by malignant foreign spirits, surpassed the charnel shudders produced by the Gothic, Algernon Blackwood's psychic invasions, where localities, rather than mere apartments or houses alone, are haunted, diabolized by undying evil influences with compound power. His elementals, that control the forces of wind and wave and fire to work their demon will, are unlike anything that the early terror novel conceived of. Horace Walpole and Mrs. Radcliffe knew no thrills like those of Bram Stoker's Count Dracula, who is an immemorial evil, a vampire and werewolf as well as man, with power to change himself into a vampire bat or animal of prey at will. The Unburied, by Josephine Dascombe Bacon, is more horrific than any mere revenge ghost, however much it shrieked Vindicta. The diabolism in Arthur Machen's work reeks obscurely of a pit more horrible than epic or drama has portrayed. In general, many of the later ghostly characters are more complex, more intense and evil than the Gothic. While it is true that certain writers show a tendency to create supernatural characters having an excess of evil power beyond the previous uncanny beings, on the other hand, there is an equally strong and significant tendency to reduce the ghostly beings nearer to the human. Fiction here, as frequently, seems ahead of the general belief, and refuses to believe in the altogether evil. Ghosts, angels, witches, devils, werewolves, and so forth are now made more human, more like to man, yet without losing any of their ancient power to thrill. Ghosts in late literature have more of the mortal characteristics than ever before, as have been pointed out in a previous chapter. They look more human, more normal. They're clad in everyday garments of varied colors, from red shirts and khaki riding habits to ball gowns, though gray seems the favored shade for shades, as well as witches, and they have lost that look of pallor that distinguished early phantoms. Now they are more than merely vaporous projections as they used to be, more than merely phantasmogenetic apparitions, but are healthy, red-blooded spooks. They are not tongue-tied as their ancestors were, but are very chatty, giving forth views on everything they are interested in, from socialism to the present war, and their ranges of interests has widened immeasurably. It would seem that the literacy test has been applied to ghosts in recent fiction. Modern specters are so normal in appearance that often no one recognizes them as ghosts, as in Edith Wharton's story Afterwards, where the peculiar thing about the apparition haunting a certain house is that it is not till long afterwards that one knows it was a ghost. The man in the gray suit, whom the wife thinks a chance caller, is the spirit of a man not yet dead, a terrible living revenge ghost who finally takes his victim mysteriously away with him. Modern ghosts have both emotions and emotions like men, hence mortals are coming to regard them more sympathetically, to have more of a fellow feeling for them. Likewise, the angels are now only a very little higher, if any, than men. Seraphs are democratic, and angels have developed a sense of humor that renders them more interesting than they used to be. The winged being that H.G. Wells' vicar goes gunning for is a charming youth with a naive satire, as the angels in Mark Twain's story of heaven are realistically mortal and masculine in tastes. They care little for harps and crowns, grow fidgety under excess of rest, and engage in all sorts of activities retaining their individual tastes. James Stephen's archangel, seraph, and cherub are chatty, cordial souls with an avidity for cold potatoes and Irish companionship. The demons as well have felt the same leveling influence experienced by the ghosts and the angels, only in their case the thing is reversed, and they are raised to the grade of humanity. We are coming to see in modern fiction, at least, that the devil is not really black, only a pleasant mottled gray like ourselves. Satan in Mark Twain's posthumous novel is an affable young fellow claiming to be the nephew and namesake of the personage best known by that name. Bernard Shaw's devil is of a Chesterfieldian courtesy, willing to speed the parting as to welcome the coming guest. I found no comic use of the werewolf or of the vampire, though there are several comic witch stories, yet all these personages are humanized in modern fiction. We feel in some recent supernatural stories a sense of a continuing current of life. These ghosts, devils, witches, angels, and so forth are too real to be cut short by an author's finis. Another aspect of the leveling influence is seen in the more than natural power of motion, feeling, and intelligence given to inanimate objects, machinery, plants, and animals in late literature. The idea of endowing inanimate figures with life and personality is seen several times in Hawthorne's stories, as his snow image, Drown's wooden image, the vivified scarecrow Feathertop that the witch makes. The clay figures that Satan in Mark Twain's novel models endues with life, then destroys with fine casual carelessness of a god, remind one of an incident from mythology. The statue in Edith Wharton's The Duchess at Prayer that changes its expression, showing on its marble face through a century the loathing and horror that the living countenance wore, or Lord Dunsany's Jade Idol that comes with stony steps across the desolate moor to exact vengeance on four men helpless in its presence, has a more intense thrill than Otranto's peripatetic statue. Lord Dunsany's The Gods of the Mountains, of which Frank Harris says, "It is the only play which has meant anything to me in 20 years, shows an inexorable fatality as in the Greek drama. Science is revealing wonderful facts, and fiction is quick to realize the possibilities for startling situations in every field. So diabolic botanical specimens, animals endowed with human or more than human craft, sometimes gifted with immortality as well, add a new interest to uncanny fiction. And the new machines that make all impossibilities come to pass inspire a significant class of supernatural stories. In general, a new force is given to all things, to raise them to the level of the human. In the same way, nature is given a new power and becomes man's equal, sometimes far his superior, in thought and action. The maelstrom in Poe's story is more than merely a part of the setting. It is a terrible force in action. Algernon Blackwood stresses this variously in his stories, as where Egypt is shown as a vital presence and power, or where the goblin trees are as awful as any of the other characters of evil, or in the wind and flame on the mountain that are elements of supernatural power, with a resistless lure for mortals, or in the vampire soil that steals a man's strength. This may be illustrated as well from the drama, as in Maeterlinck's where death is the silent, invisible, yet dominant force, or in Synge's where the sea is a terrible foe, lying in wait for man, or in August Strom's The Daughter of the Moor, where the Moor is a compelling character of evil. Gothic fiction did associate the phenomena of nature with the moods of the action, yet in a less effective way. The aspects of nature in recent literature have been raised to the level of humanity, becoming mortal or else diabolic or divine. In general, in modern fiction, man now makes his supernatural characters in his own image. Ghosts, angels, devils, witches, werewolves are humanized, made to like man in appearance, passions, and powers. On the other hand, plants, inanimate objects, and animals, as well as the phenomena of nature, are raised to the human plane and given access of power. This leveling process democratizes the supernatural elements and tends to make them almost equal. The present revival of interest in the supernatural and its appearance in literature are as marked in the drama as in fiction or poetry. Mr. E.C. Whitmore, in a recent published volume on the supernatural in tragedy, has ably treated the subject, especially in the Greek classic period and the Elizabethan age in England. His thesis is that the supernatural is most frequently associated with tragedy and is found where tragedy is at its best. This may be true of earlier periods of the tragic drama, yet it would be going too far to make the assertion of the drama of the present time. The occult makes its appearance to a considerable extent now in melodrama and even comedy, though with no decrease in the frequency and effectiveness of its use in tragedy. This only illustrates the widening of its sphere and its adaptability to varying forms of art. A brief survey of some of the plays produced in the last few years, most of them being seen in New York, will illustrate the extent to which the ghostly motifs are used on the stage of today. Double personality is represented by Edward Locke in a play which is said by critics to be virtually a dramatization of Dr. Morton Prince's study, where psychological apparatus used in laboratory experiments to expel the evil intruder from the girl. A chronoscope, a dynograph, revolving mirrors make the setting seem truly psychical. But the most dramatic instance of the kind, of course, is the dramatization of Dr. Jekyll's alter ego. The plays of Charles Rand Kennedy and Jerome K. Jerome are akin to the old mystery plays, in that they personate divinity and show the miracle of Christly influence on sinful hearts. Augustus Thomas and Edward Milton Royal introduce hypnotism as the basis of complication and denouement. Supernatural healing, miraculous intervention of divine power, occur in plays by William Vaughn Moody, Bjornson, and George M. Cohan. Another turns on converse with spirits, as does Belasco's Return of Peter Grimm, while a war play with Vita Sutton shows 4 ghosts on the stage at once, astonishing phantoms who do not realize that they are dead. Others have for their themes miracles of faith and rescue from danger. though the first named play satirizes such belief and the latter is a piece of Catholic propaganda. Magic by G.K. Chesterton introduces supernatural forces whereby strange things are made to happen, such as the changing of the electric light from green to blue. Peter Ibbotson, the dramatization of du Maurier's novel, shows dream supernaturalism and various other psychic effects in a delicate and distinctive manner. And The Willow Tree by Ben Remo and Harrison Rhodes is built upon an ancient Japanese legend relating a hamadryad myth with other supermortal fantasies such as representing a woman's soul as contained in a mirror. We have fairy plays by J.M. Barrie, W.B. Yeats, and Maeterlinck, and The Mermaid has even been staged. Bernard Shaw shows us the devil in his own hometown, while Hauptmann gives us Handel's visions of heaven. The Frankenstein theme is used to provoke laughter mixed with thrills. Owen and Robert Davis symbolize man's better angel, while The Eternal Magdalene, a dream drama, shows another piece of symbolic supernaturalism. Lord Dunsany's plays have already been mentioned. Yet the drama, though showing a definite revival of the supernatural and illustrating various forms of it, is more restricted than fiction. Many aspects of the occult appear, and the psychic drama is popular, but the necessities of presentation on the stage inevitably bar many forms of the ghostly art that take their place naturally in fiction. The closet drama does not come under this limitation, for in effect it is almost as free as fiction to introduce mystical, symbolic, and invisible presences. The closet drama is usually in poetic form, and poetry is closer akin to certain forms of the supernatural than is prose, which makes their use more natural. The literary playlet, so popular just now, uses the ghostly in many ways. One shows the archangel Raphael with his dog working miracles, while another includes in its dramatis personae a faun and a moon goddess, who insists on giving the faun a soul, at which he wildly protests. As through suffering and human pain he accepts the gift, a symbolic white butterfly poises itself on his uplifted hand, then flits toward heaven. In another, Padraic yields himself to the fairy's power as the price of bread for the girl he loves. Theodore Dreiser's short play brings in creatures impossible of representation on the stage, persistences of fish, animals, and birds, symbolic shadows, a blue sphere, a power of physics, nitrous acid, a fast mail, though trains have been used on the stage, and so forth. Instances from recent German drama might be given as the works of August Strahm, who, like Rupert Brooke and the ill-starred poets of the Irish Revolution, has fallen as a sacrifice to the war. An article in the Literary Digest says of Strahm that he felt behind all the beauty of the world its elemental passions, and believed these to be the projections of human passions in the waves of wind and light and water, in flames of earth. He includes among his characters a spider, nightingales, moonlight, wind, and blossoms. Karl Hauptmann likewise showed the elemental forces of nature and of supernature. On the battlefield of death, the dead arise to join in one dreadful chant of hate against their enemies. Leonid Andreev's striking play might be mentioned as an example from the Russian. King Hunger, Death, and Old-Time Bell Ringer are the principal actors, while the human beings are all deformed and distorted, one continuous malicious monstrosity bearing only a remote likeness to man. The starving men are slain, but over the field of the dead the motionless figure of death is seen silhouetted. But the dead arise, and a dull, distant, manifold murmur, as if underground, is heard. "We come! Woe unto the victorious!" But, as I have said, these are literary dramas, impossible of presentation on the stage, so that they are judged by literary rather than dramatic standards. For the most part, fiction is infinitely freer in its range and choice of subjects from the supernatural than is the drama. The suggestive, symbolic, mystic effects which could not in any way be presented on the stage, but which are more truly of the province of poetry, are used in prose that has a jeweled beauty and a melody as of poetry. Elements such as invisibility, for instance, and various occult agencies may be stressed and analyzed in fiction as would be impossible on the stage. The close relation between insanity and the weird can be much more effectively shown in the novel or short story than in the drama, as the forces of mystery, the incalculable agencies, can be thus better emphasized. Ghosts need to be seen on the stage to have best effect, even if they are meant as selective apparitions like Banquo, and if thus seen they are too corporeal for the most impressive influence, while in fiction they can be suggested with delicate reserve. Supernatural presences that could not be imagined on the boards may be represented in the novel or story, as Blackwood's elementals or psychic invasions. How could one stage such action, for instance, as his citizens turning into witch-cats, or his giant devil looming mightily in the heavens? Likewise, in fiction, the full presentation of scientific supernaturalism can be achieved, which would be impossible on the stage. In conclusion, it might be said that fiction offers the most popular present vehicle for expression of the undoubtedly reviving supernaturalism in English literature, and fiction is likewise the best form, that which affords the more varied chances for effectiveness. The rising tide of the unearthly in art shows itself in all literary forms, as dramatic, narrative, and lyric poetry, with a few epics. In the playlet, as in the standard drama, in the short story as in the novel. It manifests itself in countless ways in current literature, and inviting lines of investigation suggest themselves with reference to various aspects of its study. The supernatural, as especially related to religion, offers an interesting field for research. The miracles from the Bible are often used, as in Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur, and Christ is introduced in other times and places, as the war novel, or in Marie Corelli's satire on episcopacy, where the cardinal finds the Christ child outside the cathedral. The more than mortal elements, as answers to prayer, the experience of conversion, spiritual miracles, and so forth, are present to a considerable extent in modern fiction. Two very recent novels of importance base their plots on the miraculous in religion: The Brook Kerith by George Moore, and The Leatherwood God by William Dean Howells. I have touched on this aspect of the subject in a previous article. One might profitably trace out the appearances of the ghostly in modern poetry, or one might study its manifestations in the late drama, including melodrama and comedy as well as tragedy. This present treatment of the supernatural in modern English fiction makes no pretensions to being complete. It is meant to be suggestive rather than exhaustive, and I shall be gratified if it may help to arouse further interest in a significant and vital phase of our literature and lead others to pursue the investigations. End of Chapter 8. End of the Supernatural in Modern English Fiction by Dorothy Scarborough.